I'm the interpretive historian at the Montana Historical Society. I started in 1992. I never actually dreamed that I would be a historian. I started out as an English major. I majored in Anglo-Saxon and Latin and Middle English, and got a PhD actually in medieval studies that included history. The thing that is really most gratifying about Montana is that things are so accessible, and there's so many discoveries that are still just yet to be made. You know, I really like to remain objective about it, and I like to write what other people have experienced. And to me, really the reasoning behind these haunted places, it doesn't really matter whether they happen or not. It's whether or not you can link that to something that did happen in the past. That's where the explanations are. And to me, it's important to know why something happens, not just that it happens, and not to have the evidence. You know, the evidence to me is in the history. In my own house, we've heard this radio for the almost 30 years that we've owned the house. And we know that the person back in the 20s had the very first radio operation in the house. And, you know, there's just that's the explanation. That's why we hear it.
My name is Marlene Olmstead, and I have been a tour guide here at the old prison off and on for about 25 years now. I was taking a tour through the 1912 cell block, and we've gone clear up to the north end across the end of the cell block, and we're coming back down. And when we reached a certain area, I felt it was heat. It wasn't a cold spot, it was heat, pulsating heat. It almost dropped me to my knees, and I must have turned red because my tour, they were really worried. I had about 30 people on the tour. Another time, well, it was a ghost tour. You guys were here, and Julie and I were coming out, and we were right by the old theater, and we all felt something weird, and she turned around and just snapped a picture. Well, you guys saw the picture. It's where it was 5 very distinct figures.
You know, I think what most people experience when they believe that they've seen a ghost is probably residual energy. But that doesn't mean that there aren't possibly active spirits, and that's a whole different thing.
The discovery of gold brought many prospectors into the area in the 1860s, and Montana became a territory in 1864. The rapid influx of people led to boom towns that grew rapidly and declined just as quickly when the gold ran out. John Denn was known to hoard large sums of money at his liquor store. A native of Germany and a former officer in the Prussian army, Denn was drawn to the American West after the gold rush of 1849 and eventually settled in Helena, Montana. On the evening of Monday, October 27, 1879, Den closed his shop, retired to his apartment next door, donned a nightshirt, and went to bed. Sometime in the night, a visitor roused him and asked him for a bottle of whiskey. Den lit a candle, put on a pair of carpet slippers, and took his collar downstairs to the cellar. He picked up a funnel and was bending down to turn the faucet on the whiskey cask when a heavy blow landed on top of his head, crushing his skull. He was found the next morning, curled almost into a ball, stiffened on the stone floor. His safe was open and empty.
There's been a lot of research that has been done about the vigilantes and about the 3777. And supposedly the 3777 was never used in that early vigilante period in the 1860s. That it was used for the first time with the murder of John Den here in Helena in 1879, actually right about Halloween time. They never did catch the person, and it's kind of an interesting situation because that is still an unsolved mystery, and possibly linked to some ghostly activity too, and so it makes it a very important murder, kind of a catalyst.
The murder brought an abrupt end to the period of relative tranquility that Helena had enjoyed during the 1870s and sent a wave of alarm through the community. It revived memories of Montana's gold rush era when the reign of violent lawlessness triggered one of the deadliest episodes of vigilante justice in American history. During the first 5 weeks of 1864, while the rest of the nation was preoccupied by the Civil War, a small corps of armed horsemen swept through the mining camps of the Rocky Mountain foothills in southwest Montana and hanged 21 troublemakers, including a rogue sheriff, creating a legend whose impact can still be felt today. The mysterious numbers 3777, often posted on doors, was used for years as a symbol of banishment in Montana. But contrary to widespread belief, they were never used by the original vigilantes of 1864 who hanged Sheriff Henry Plummer.
Here's what I think the 3777 represents. There were a number of Masons that signed that original vigilante oath in 1863 in Nevada City is where it was signed, and a number of those people were Masons. Masonry was very important to the founding of the territory of Montana. Masons were always prominent, and so I do believe that the Masons really were responsible for coming up with that 3777. The 3 represents the 3 men who opened and closed the first lodge meeting on Mullen Pass in 1862. They were coming across with the Fisk expedition, and there were 3 Masons that happened to be enjoying the sunset on top of this pass, and they got to talking and they realized that they were all 3 Masons. And so they opened and closed the first lodge meeting in Montana. That's the 3. The 7 is possibly the 7 liberal arts, or possibly the 7 original signers who were Masons of the vigilante oath. The 77 is the first person who died at Bannock, who was a Mason. His name was William Bell, and he died of mountain fever, but before he died, he asked to have a Masonic funeral. And so they didn't have any idea how many Masons might be in the camp. So they put it out, we're going to have this Masonic funeral, all Masons come. 76 Masons showed up, and the 77th was the corpse himself.
Today, the numbers appear on the shoulder patch and car door insignia of the Montana Highway Patrol and are meant to convey a benign message of law and order. As more and more white people came into the area, Indians lost access to their traditional hunting grounds and conflicts grew. The Sioux and Cheyenne were victorious in 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce won a battle in the Big Hole Basin, 1877. Yet in the end, Indians could not hold out against the strength of the United States Army. Miners weren't the only settlers in Montana. Cattle ranches began flourishing in western valleys during the 1860s as demand for beef in the new mining communities increased. After 1870, open-range cattle operations spread across the high plains, taking advantage of the free public domain land. During the 1880s, railroads crossed Montana and the territory became a state in 1889, making it the 41st state to be admitted to the Union. Hard rock mining also began at this time. Butte became famous when silver and copper were discovered. The Anaconda Copper Company, owned by Marcus Daly, became one of the world's largest copper mining companies and exercised an inordinate influence in the state. In 1910, Congress created Glacier National Park, and forest fires devastated western Montana. In 1916, Missoula resident Jeanette Rankin was the first elected woman to the U.S. Congress. In 1943, 70 coal miners were killed in the Smith Mine disaster. In 1980, volcanic fallout from the Mount St. Helena eruption blanketed Montana, and the Anaconda Copper Company closed Montana operations after nearly 100 years. Today, Montana's largest industry isn't gold, copper, silver, or even oil. It's agriculture, generating $2.6 billion in income on 29,400 farms and ranches in 2010, making it the largest industry in Montana. Wheat and beef account for about 3/4 of the state's agricultural products produced yearly. Other crops include barley, number 3 in the U.S., honey, number 5 in the U.S., and oilseeds such as safflower and canola. Montana is also known for its hay, sweet cherries, sugar beets, and seed potatoes. Lewis and Clark came through the Missoula Valley in 1805, but it wasn't until 1860 that the Europeans settled here. Before settlers arrived, western Montana was home to the Salish, Pende Orel, and Kootenai tribes. The name Missoula comes from a butchered version of the Salish name for the area, Ne Missoula Taku, meaning cold water, in reference to the Clark Fork River that runs through the center of town. Missoula is located along the Clark Fork River near its confluence with the Bitterroot River in western Montana and at the convergence of 5 mountain ranges, thus is often described as the hub of the 5 valleys. In 1860, C.P. Higgins and F.L. Warden opened a trading market that they called the Hellgate Village. Today, you can buy wine, espresso, and huge deli sandwiches at Warden's Market on Higgins Street downtown. The name Hellgate came from French trappers who found carnage from warfare, including bones and bodies, in the canyon on the east edge of town. The Blackfeet and the Flathead used the close confines of the canyon to battle one another. The canyon is still called Hellgate today, but only the winter winds are a threat now. The region was first surveyed by Washington Territory Governor Isaac Stevens in the 1850s by congressional request as the demands of developing a transcontinental rail route. Stevens would also negotiate the Treaty of Hellgate, through which the Native American tribes of western Montana relinquished their territories to the U.S. government. Stevens was assisted by Lieutenant John Mullen, who would build the Mullen Road in 1853. The wagon road was the first to cross the Rocky Mountains to the inland of the Pacific Northwest and would enable the establishment of Fort Missoula in 1877. Missoula never boomed as many western Montana towns did as a consequence of the gold rush, though the town did grow rapidly, and by 1872 the town had 66 new buildings. Higgins and Warden established the town's first stores and banks. By 1876, the pair faced its largest competition and rivalry from Eddie Hammond and Company, who established the Missoula Mercantile Company. Its development was stimulated after 1883 when it became a division point on the Northern Pacific Railway, and with the founding there of the University of Montana in 1893. Territorial Governor Benjamin F. Potts approved a charter for the town of Missoula. The need for lumber for the railway and its bridges spurred the opening of multiple sawmills in the area, and in turn, the beginning of Missoula's lumber industry. The economic frenzy led to the construction of many of the historic buildings in downtown today. In particular, architect A.J. Gibson arrived in the late 1880s and designed many of Missoula's most recognizable buildings, including the Missoula County Courthouse and the University of Montana's main hall. The continued economic windfall from railroad construction and the lumber mills led to a further boom in Missoula's population. A.B. Hammond and Copper King's Marcus Daly and William A. Clark competed fiercely in the region over lumber share and Missoula investments. And in 1908, Missoula became the district and later a regional headquarters for the United States Forest Service, which also began training smoke jumpers in 1942. The start of the modern era began when all logging yards in Missoula, which had once completely driven the city's economy, vanished. Once logging vanished, the Missoula Downtown Association was born, and downtown Missoula became what it is today, leaving only traces of what once fueled the local economy.
I'm going back to my hometown, gonna sit right down and take a look around. Tall trees talking all along the shore, where the wood meets the river.
By the 1990s, Missoula's lumber industry had gradually disappeared, and today, the city's largest employers are the University of Montana and Missoula's 2 hospitals. Missoula is the second largest city in Montana, boasting a metro population of over 110,000 people and home to one of the best college football teams at the FCS level. The University of Montana Grizzly football program has been second to none since the completion of Washington Grizzly Stadium, with an average attendance per game of nearly 26,000 fans. The city is also home to 4 breweries, 2 being Montana's largest and oldest active breweries. The most culturally active town in Montana, Missoula boasts a plethora of choices for the culturally minded local or artist. Whether it's art or music being created in the street or a gala event at the local museum, Missoula has what it takes to satisfy even the most avant-garde individual. No matter what you call it, Missoula, Montana is a rare combination of urban and outdoor, cultured and down-home, cowboy and hippie. With friendly people and storefront shopping just a walk away, the Missoula Historic Downtown District is the perfect place to spend a weekend afternoon. But behind the friendly feel of the city lies a darker experience. With the Old West history Missoula has seen, there are bound to be remnants of its past lingering around. Some good and some bad, I suppose. The Native Americans that once inhabited the area used to say that the Missoula Valley was full of evil spirits. Is this true? That is what Tortured Souls Investigations, a local and well-known paranormal research group, set out to investigate. TSI was created in 1999 by a father and son with an avid love for history and paranormal, Eric and Chris Bradley. They have been featured in 3 books and numerous newspaper articles, along with dozens of journalism student reports. Recently, they are accepted as the newest TAPS family member group in Montana. They cover Western Montana and the Montana Paranormal Research Society, MTPRS, out of Billings. They cover Eastern Montana. These 2 groups are the only certified TAPS-affiliated groups in Montana. The Atlantic Paranormal Society, otherwise known as TAPS, is a paranormal group featured in the sci-fi hit show Ghost Hunters. The TAPS family is a subgroup from the organization of TAPS. It was formed by Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson in order to network with other professional paranormal research groups from around the world. TAPS themselves handles hundreds of cases that range between homeowners, business owners, government properties, historical sites, etc. Now, due to the sheer volume of clients in need, TAPS realized that by pooling together the resources from other teams, these cases can be handled. Chris, along with being the co-founder of TSI, is also a media arts student at the University of Montana studying filmmaking. In a previous interview, Ellen Baumler from the Montana Historical Society, author of Spirit Tailings and Beyond Spirit Tailings, said, quote, "Know the history of the place and make it relative, and then your explorations into the supernatural have some legitimate meaning." Chris and TSI has never strayed from that point. With those words in mind, the search for imprints from Montana's vibrant history began. Our first haunted tale of tortured souls of Western Montana brings us to St. Mary's Cemetery. This Catholic cemetery was created in 1884 and has a lot of history throughout the years, leaving a profound energy behind wandering within its gates. Prior to establishing formal cemeteries in Missoula, burials occurred throughout the valley along wagon trails and rail lines, on the family homestead, and in outlying areas near town. By 1884, Missoula Cemetery was formally established as Missoula's Public Cemetery Option and St. Mary's Cemetery, established in the same year, and was a Catholic congregation cemetery option. Some families disinterred individuals from their original locations and moved them to one of the 2 newly established cemeteries. Many others buried throughout the valley remained in place, and their gravesites have simply disappeared with time. As development grew, many times bones were unearthed denoting a burial site of some kind. Records of early burials are scarce, if documented at all, resulting in many unknowns and forgotten souls. When Father L.B. Palladino arrived in Missoula in 1873, he was intent on solemnizing life's major passages of birth, marriage, and death. Father Palladino was revered for establishing the first Catholic school and Providence Hospital in Missoula. The Catholic Diocese officially purchased the cemetery on February 11, 1901 for $100. Original restrictions allowed burial sites for only those in good standing with the Catholic Church. In fear of filling the historic cemetery, the diocese purchased additional cemetery land from the city of Missoula. This has always been a cemetery that has made many locals uneasy while passing by it. The feeling of lost souls watching as many play rec league slow-pitch softball right across the street. TSI founder Eric and Chris Bradley has several unsettling stories of their own about this old Catholic graveyard. In 1992, Eric passed by St. Mary's every morning as he was working a part-time paper route for some extra income. But what he saw one morning will always be in the back of his mind. As he passed by the front gate off of Turner Street, he noticed 3 hooded figures, all in black, as if they were almost floating down the center of the cemetery. and eventually just faded into the tombstones. In 1999, Chris and Eric went back to the cemetery where many strange stories have been reported. Dead set on finding answers for the stories, they were armed with their digital cameras and infrared camcorder. That night is what got the two hooked and eventually led to the creation of TSI. That night, the two had recorded a few disembodied voices crying out from the center of the cemetery, but nobody was there. In 2005, Chris was doing a project for his history class and took a series of pictures at the old cemetery, and to this day, they still have not been explained or recreated. Around this time, TSI was there getting ready to wrap things up about 3 a.m., and as they walked out the front gate, they passed a man in a suit walking into the cemetery. The man smiled at him. Chris asked how he was doing, and the man simply responded, "I'm just heading home." Chris turned and snapped a picture of the man, just in case, and sure enough, nothing showed up in the picture. Chris, finding this to be a little creepy, then started to walk a bit faster. As they were driving away, the man was just standing in the northwest corner of the cemetery, just staring at them as they drove off. Chris hasn't been back since. Our journey of haunted western Montana takes us 80 miles east of Missoula to Deer Lodge, Montana. Home to the Montana State Prison and the former Territorial Prison, Deer Lodge has seen its fair share of history, ranging from 2 deputy wardens killed at the prison to the Montana National Guard storming the prison gates and firing bazooka rounds at the Northwest Tower. The town is perhaps best known as the home of Montana State Prison, a major local employer. Deer Lodge, Montana was founded in 1867. Deer Lodge was also once an important railroad town, serving as a division headquarters for the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad before the railroad's local abandonment in 1980. Deer Lodge is also the location of Grant Coors Ranch National Historic Site, dedicated to the interpretation of the frontier cattle ranching era. This site was the home of Conrad Coors, one of the famous cattle kings of Montana, whose land holdings once stretched over 1 million acres of Montana, Wyoming, and Alberta. The Grant Coors Ranch was built in 1862 by Johnny Grant, a Scottish-French fur trader and trapper who encouraged his people to settle in Deer Lodge because of its pleasant climate and large areas of bunch grass prairie, ideal for raising cattle and horses. The town's name derives from the geological formation known as Warm Springs Mound, which contained a natural saline that made a natural salt lick for the local deer population. Today, Deer Lodge is still the home of the Montana State Prison, located about 4 miles west of town, and has a population of 3,100 people. Like other fledgling territories in the 19th century American West, Montana had become wild when the gold rush attracted not only those wishing to find their fortunes, but also thieves, gamblers, and murderers. For several years following the gold discoveries of 1862, the Montana vigilantes took it upon themselves to punish these many offenders in the lawless land of Montana. Finally, seeing a need for more organized forms of law enforcement, the Montana Territorial Legislature requested funds for a prison during its winter session in 1866 and 1867. The United States Congress agreed that the territory needed a prison, approved the request for the funding, and Deer Lodge was chosen for the site of the new territorial prison. Stout iron bars slammed shut and locked for the first time on July 2, 1871. On that day, Montana's territorial prison in Deer Lodge incarcerated its first occupant. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the old Montana prison was built by inmate labor. This turn-of-the-century fortress was home to at least one member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Almost from the beginning, the prison was deemed inadequate and overcrowded, a condition that would result in slow but continual construction at the prison for the next 50 years. When Montana became the 41st state on November 8, 1889, the prison became Montana's responsibility. Finding it expensive to operate, the Board of Prison Commissioners contracted out the entire prison operation in 1890. Believing the prisoners should work, Conley began to update the prison by first replacing its 12-foot wooden fence with a massive sandstone wall in 1893. 4.5 feet thick, the wall formed a solid perimeter around the prison. As a further measure to reduce crowding, put the prisoners to work, and generate income from the prison, outside prison camps were established where prisoners would live and be hired out for both public and private work. In 1908, the prison witnessed one of the most tragic events when 2 prisoners by the names of George Rock and William Hayes attempted to escape. Fleeing from the federal building, their failed attempt resulted in the death of Deputy Warden John Robinson, and Warden Frank Conley was required to get 103 stitches in his back and neck from stab wounds he received from the inmates. As a result, George Rock was hanged inside the prison yard that year, and William Hayes met a similar fate the following year. They were the only inmates to be executed in the prison. Montana policy at the time was the inmate was transferred to the county where the crime was committed and the execution was carried out there. Not all inmates were so violent, however, and one was downright liked by the guards and prisoners. At the age of 40, Pete Eitner was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in 1918. A model prisoner, he was assigned to tend to the prison turkeys and soon received the nickname of Turkey Pete. As he aged, he began to lose some of his mental facilities, and when a man stopped one day to admire his turkeys, Eitner sold him the entire flock for 25 cents each. This ended the turkey tending days, but that was okay, because he soon fantasized a new job as the owner and administrator of the prison. Prison officials humored him, allowing Eitner to run the prison from his cell. Fake checks were printed for him, with which he paid the prison expenses and payroll. When Turkey Pete died in 1967, he was 89. His cell, number 1, was retired. His funeral was the only one ever held within the walls of the prison. Today, cell number 1 displays photos of Turkey Pete, as well as his few belongings. Protests from labor unions and security concerns put an end to outside work in the 1920s. However, food production continued at the 30,000-acre prison-owned ranch. Work inside the prison continued in various industries, including cobbler and upholstery shops, and a garment industry that made clothes for state wards. A state license plate facility began production in the late 1920s. Though Conley's administration made drastic improvements to the prison, it continually suffered from overcrowding through the decades. On April 16, 1959, the prison suffered a major riot when 2 inmates by the names of Jerry Miles and Lee Smart Jr. led some 12 inmates in an escape attempt.
Mom was the first woman in the U.S. to work full-time behind the walls of a male-oriented prison. It was just one of those things that was not done, but she was interviewed to be a social service worker and with a high school education. And Mother was an excellent typist, could take shorthand, and started as the only woman in here. At the time of the 59 riot, Mother was the only woman in here. And the inmates themselves got her out just shortly before the deputy warden was murdered.
In the fight, Deputy Warden Theodore Rothy was shot and killed.
All I remember is a gurney with 2 brown shoes. His body was covered, thank God. And my best friend, Phyllis Rothy, and her father was the deputy warden. And she looked at me when the gate opened at Tower 7 and the body was brought out. She said, "Oh my God, Marlene, I hope that's not anybody we know," and it was her dad. And then just at that time, I saw my mom come out on the porch of the warden's house. And I was extremely conflicted with feelings that lasted a lot of years. I felt terrible for Phyllis. But I was so relieved to see my mom, and then I felt guilty that I was that relieved that it was not my mom that was killed. She hated me for 30 years. Why did my mom have to live when her dad was killed?
The hostages were held for 3 days while the riot raged on. After the National Guard was brought in and fired a few bazooka rounds at the Northwest Tower, the 2 ringleaders died in a murder-suicide, when Miles shot Smart and then turned the gun on himself. After the conclusion of the 1959 riot, the women were transferred outside the walls, and that secluded section of the prison across the courtyard was turned into a maximum security unit to house the most dangerous of prisoners. The current maximum security section of the old prison housed the women from its completion in 1908 until 1959.
We didn't see each other after we graduated from high school, which was just a month after the riot. And we tried to talk once and it just wasn't working. So we both went our own ways, lived our own lives. And 30 years from then, we had a high school reunion, and Phyllis came. And I went up to her and I said, "Do you think it's been long enough we can handle this?" And she said, "Yes." And so the two of us just went off by ourselves. And I like to say that it took about 2 6-packs of beer and a gallon of tears. And our friendship's back on the track, and we are still emailing to each other.
Finally, the old and overcrowded prison was closed in 1979, and its prisoners moved to a new facility 4 miles west of Deer Lodge. Empty of prisoners and standing silent, the Powell County Museum and Arts Foundation obtained the building's lease for use as a museum. After some restoration and the construction of the visitor center, the complex reopened in 1980, providing tours to more than 40,000 visitors each year. Visitors to the museum can take guided or self-guided tours through several of the prison's buildings, glimpsing the daily life of prison routines. As visitors walk through the intimidating cell houses, informational signs provide details of the prison life, where tourists will continue to see original schedules, rules, prisoner artwork, and even moldering blankets on many of the iron cots in the prison cells. Evidence of a 1959 riot can still be seen in shattered bricks on the West Tower. Cramped blackout cells can be toured, and the gallows that once hanged capital offenders remain for those of us with a morbid curiosity. In 2005, then a high school senior at Sentinel High School in Missoula, Chris Bratling, the Tortured Souls Investigation co-founder, was doing a project for a psychology class. This project was a film that featured a few locations around the area and focused on the spooky tales passed down through history. Chris assembled his team, including his father Eric, the founder, his sister Brooke, and Cody, his stepbrother, and Eric's longtime friend Adam Rush, and 2 of his sons. This was the most intense investigation to date. Most of the crew had never been to the old prison, let alone at night investigating claims of the paranormal passed down from its brutal past. As the night progressed, a few strange things happened. Chris and Cody were heading out through the courtyard to a maximum security location, and when they stepped foot in the corridor, the door of the visitor center closed by itself, and the two captured it on video.
I only got 35 minutes of battery left on this camera. I only got 35 minutes of battery left on this camera.
Surprised and excited about what they just recorded, they called the others and told them to come out to the maximum security building. Once the others joined the group, they decided to do an electronic voice phenomena session, or EVP session for short. After the questions concluded and the investigation ended, they were in the gift shop talking with John O'Donnell, the old prison director, about their findings. That's when Adam came across a faint woman's voice from a recording in the maximum security building. It sounded like it said, "Nancy," when Adam asked the question, "Is there anybody here?" At first, the group was a little confused and thought it was out of place coming from within the walls of a male prison. That's when John informed the group that the maximum security building was the women's prison from 1908 to 1959. Needless to say, everyone was in shock after hearing the chilling voice. The group gathered their equipment and headed back to Missoula. Once the data was reviewed and Chris had his final project done, him and Eric went back to the old prison to meet with John O'Donnell and showed him the final project, and that is how the Old Prison Ghost Tours by TSI was born. They did a series of tours for reporters, bloggers, and just your everyday paranormal or historical enthusiasts. The tour was about 90 minutes long and featured a historical rundown of each location with paranormal reports mixed in. Wanting to do something that has never been done before, TSI worked out a plan with the prison staff to take the tours up into the Northwest Tower, or the Tower of Death, as the prison staff refers to it. So the weekend of April 16, 2009, the 50-year anniversary of the 1959 riot, they planned on taking the tours up to the spot where it all ended in a murder-suicide. That Friday morning, prison staff opened the door to the tower for the first time in over 30 years, releasing whatever it was storing to the general population of restless souls that already inhabited the century-old prison. Just hours after they opened the door in the tower to prepare the tours for that weekend, a couple of tourgoers on a self-guided day tour reported to the front desk that they saw 2 guys peering down at them from the 3rd level of the cell house. Prison staff went back out with the couple to see where this happened and look for the perpetrators. The couple pointed up to the very same spot where Miles and Smart started the riot 50 years prior. The staff couldn't locate anybody that shouldn't be in there and checked the books, and the couple was the only tour goers at the time. The coincidence of this occurrence, with the 50-year anniversary that very same weekend, and the fact that they disturbed the tower where the two men met their demise after being locked up for over 30 years, was significant beyond belief. Did the couple see the restless spirits of Lee Smart and Jerry Miles, reliving the tragic incidents that led to the 3 deaths, including their own? Some say yes. Over the 3 years that TSI led tours at the old prison, they were there dozens of times, and it never seemed to disappoint in terms of gathering paranormal evidence. They no longer give tours at the old prison, but know that it doesn't take a ghost tour at night to have your own supernatural experience. In the 100 years in use, the giant sandstone wall saw 27,000 men and women lose their freedom and identities. The remnants of the misguided humanity once stored inside the imposing stone walls have left an impression. These traces follow the visitors every step. Shadows loiter in the dark recesses and secret places. Visitors will tell you that there is a palpable energy, thick enough to change the minds of even the most skeptical. Helena was inadvertently founded by 4 men, all from Georgia, and known in the history books as the 4 Georgians. These 4 men, rather desperate after searching throughout western Montana for gold and finding nothing, stumbled into the area that is now Helena. A July night in 1864, the men decided to take one last chance at mining in the nearby creek. As luck and fate would have it, the men found gold that evening. They named the stream they found the gold in, appropriately enough, Last Chance Gulch. Word soon got out about the gold strike, and seemingly overnight, Helena became a boom town. In just a few short years, several hundred businesses had opened up in Helena, and more than 3,000 people called Helena home. Moreover, many of the previous mining strikes in other mining areas of Montana were beginning to play out. As such, many of the miners in these areas gravitated towards Helena. Initially, the new town had a less than inspiring name of Crabtown, named after one of the 4 Georgians who found gold. However, many of the miners were from Minnesota. These miners soon began calling the town after another town in Minnesota called St. Helena. This name was soon shortened to Helena, which is the name today. A territorial capital was established in Virginia City, which was right next to Bannack. Bannack was the first major gold strike town in Montana, being established just a few years earlier in 1862. However, with the boom in Helena and the influx of miners from the Bannack gold strike, it was decided to move the territorial capital to Helena in 1875. In 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad arrived in Helena, further fueling the city's growth. Moreover, with the establishment of the territorial capital in Helena, the city began a slow move away from the typical mining town and prevented the collapse of the town when the gold ran out in Last Chance Gulch. The town site was first surveyed in 1865 by Captain John Wood. However, many of the original streets followed chaotic paths of miners going around claims and following the winding gulch. By 1888, about 50 millionaires lived in Helena, more per capita than any city in the world. About $3.6 billion in today's dollars worth of gold was taken from Last Chance Gulch over a 20-year period. The Last Chance Placer is one of the most famous placer deposits in the western United States. Most of the production occurred before 1868, and much of the placer is now under the streets and buildings of Helena. But even as late as the 1970s, when repairs were being made to a bank, a vein of placer gold was found under the bank's foundation. This large concentration of wealth made for a large amount of culture, much of which still exists and is also evidenced in the varied architecture of the city and its Victorian neighborhoods. The period also marked the rise of a thriving red light district populated by well-known local madams such as Josephine, aka Chicago Joe, Airy, who built a thriving business empire between 1874 and 1893, becoming one of the largest and most influential landowners in Helena. The brothels of Helena were a successful part of the local business community well into the 20th century, ending with the death of Helena's last madam, Big Dorothy Baker, in 1973. In 1889, railroad magnate Charles Arthur Broadwater opened his fabled Hotel Broadwater and Natatorium west of Helena. The Natatorium was home of the world's first indoor swimming pool. Damaged in the earthquake in 1935, it was closed in 1941. The many buildings on the property were demolished in 1976. Today, the Broadwater Fitness Center stands just west of the hotel and Natatorium's original location, complete with an outdoor pool heated by natural spring water running underneath it. In 1902, the Montana State Capitol was completed. Helena has been the capital of Montana Territory since 1875, and the state of Montana since 1889. A large portion of the conflict between Marcus Daly and William Andrews Clark, the Copper Kings, was over the location of the state capital. Until the 1900 census, Helena was the most populated city in the state. In 1935, Helena was struck by a series of earthquakes. On October 12th, a 5.9, October 19th, a 6.3, and the aftershock occurred on October 31st, hitting 6.0. 2 people died in the main shock, and 2 others died as a result of the October 31st aftershock. Property damage was over $4 million. Today, Helena is still the state capital and has a metro population of around 76,000 people. Helena is home to Carroll College, a Catholic liberal arts school opened in 1909, and Helena College, University of Montana, a 2-year affiliate campus of the University of Montana in Missoula, and that opened in 1939. Mary Dunphy is a statistic, an example of one of the worst terrors of life in remote Montana Territory during the 1880s, and her presence, lingering in the old graveyard, makes her more than a faceless name on a stone monument.
Oftentimes, people who were buried in Benton Avenue Cemetery have been moved, and so later family members didn't want their family to be buried in this rather neglected cemetery, which it was, during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So, but the epidemic itself, yes, is significant. The aftermath of it, I guess, is what is significant to Benton Avenue Cemetery, because Mrs. Dunphy was taking care of 2 of the little children who were victims. And Mrs. Dunphy's large monument is there in Benton Avenue, and the little children's tombstone is also there. That's a very poignant little chair with clothing draped over it.
Mrs. Dunphy was a victim of her own good heart. In the late fall of 1885, a diphtheria epidemic threatened the residents of Lewis and Clark County. By January of 1886, when the disease had taken its deadly toll and a number of children had died, among the dead were 5-year-old Blanche and 8-year-old Jenny, daughters of prominent Helena physician Ben C. Brooke, who was powerless to intervene when the disease attacked his own children.
Even a couple of children of Dr. Ben Brooke died also, and he was powerless to save his own children. It was just a little bit before the vaccine was discovered in 1894, so very tragic event, tragic for Helena too.
5 of Calvin and Margaret Beach's 10 children, ages ranging from 4 to 15, died between August and December. The Beaches lived on a farm in the Prickly Pear Valley. Their neighbors were too afraid of the disease to assist the family, so Calvin Beach had to attend the burials with his own teams and wagons 5 different times. Felix Kuhn, almost 2, and his older sister Norma Alda, who was almost 5, died in December. Fatal in 1 out of 2 cases, diphtheria tortured both the afflicted and the parents who had to watch helplessly as their child died. Although diphtheria usually struck between the ages of 2 and 14, adults sometimes fell victim too. Mary Dunphy died of the disease on Christmas Eve, the day after Norma Kuhn. Mrs. Dunphy had nursed the Kuhn children and sat beside little Felix as he died. She was too ill to attend Norma at the end.
There was really no stopping it. They had a lot of cures, and sometimes the cures were fatal. They would do things like blow sulfur into your throat through a quill. They would make you breathe the fumes of turpentine on the stove. I mean, it's really horrible to think of the things that they made people do. But basically what happens is a grayish membrane grows across the throat and suffocates the person. And there's really not very much you can do. Some people did survive, but 1 out of 2 children who got the disease died.
The mid-19th century did see remarkable strides in medicine, including the diphtheria antitoxin, first available to the public in 1895. It was, however, a decade too late to help the victims of the 1885 epidemic. Diphtheria, whooping cough, scarlet fever, measles, and tuberculosis were among the common diseases, a constant threat and worry that loomed over the early community. The graves of the Brooke, Beach, and Harris children illustrate a bizarre historical fact. There was frequent movement of the community's early dead. Coon children, Mary Dumphy, and Mary's husband Elijah, who died 3 years after his wife, further demonstrate what happened to the graves of the pioneers whose parents moved on or who left no heirs. They were usually forgotten, and their graves left to crumble and deteriorate with neglect. With Helena's first recorded death, that of Dr. L. Rodney Pokake of tuberculosis in the spring of 1865, the mining camp had need of a burial ground. Masons conducted the funeral with great formality and fanfare, and it was the first formal gathering of the order in Helena. A city cemetery had been well established on high ground overlooking the gulch. By 1868, at least 2 more cemeteries served Helena, the Catholic Cemetery on Oaks and the Jewish Home of Peace adjacent to the present-day Capitol High School. The old Catholic cemetery is now the site of Robinson Park, but the Home of Peace remains active. There were other smaller, earlier cemeteries in use briefly. Boot Hill, for example, was a location of at least one burial, recorded unofficially by an eyewitness because of its proximity to the Hangman's Tree. When Helena became a territorial capital in 1875, the capital city wanted its buildings and community resources to showcase its importance. A grand new school worthy of a territorial capital was in the planning stages. Old Central School, the first graded school in the territory, opened in January of 1876. The rise overlooking the gulch was the best, most visible location to build the school, but that entailed moving part of the city cemetery, active now for a decade. It was neither an easy nor a pleasant task moving a cemetery. Not all the graves had markers for one thing, and so in many cases it was a game of move 'em when you find 'em. The method of burial, too, in roughly and hastily made pine boxes or worse, left corpses in various stages of decomposition. This made removal difficult and kinda grisly. Another problem was where to put the newly unburied dead. Lewis and Clark County created Benton Avenue Cemetery in 1870, and so it provided the solution to the latter problem.
Well, Benton Avenue Cemetery was not the first cemetery. It was created in 1870. The first cemetery was located where Central School is today. And when Central School was built overlooking the ridge, when Helena became the territorial capital, that school was built as probably the most grand in the territory, to glorify the new capital city. And so it was decided to build that on that prominent ridge where the first cemetery was. So all of the burials that they encountered when they moved, when they dug the foundation for Central School, they moved out to Benton Avenue, which was already created, but it was more of a county type cemetery. So with the moving of those graves out to Benton Avenue, then Benton Avenue after 1875 became the regular city cemetery, and between 1875 and 1890, most everyone who was Protestant was buried there.
Benton Avenue became the receptacle for burials clearly marked with tombstones or wooden markers, as well as unmarked graves encountered during the digging of the school's foundation. Among the graves transferred to Benton Avenue was that of Langford Peel, killed in the saloon affray in 1867. Wilbur Sanders took a fancy to the wooden headboard that marked Langston's grave, likely thinking that it should be saved for posterity. Sanders took the man's wooden grave marker home to his house in nearby 7th and Ewing. There in the attic it stayed until 1930s when the Sanders family gave it to the Montana Historical Society. It remains in the collection today, a rare, well-preserved relic of Helena's earliest history. The epitaph reads, quote, "In life beloved by his friends and respected by his enemies, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I know that my Redeemer liveth." Peel himself lost out. His new grave at Benton Avenue was, and today, still unmarked. An informal tally taken in 1883 revealed that only 1/4 of the graves in the city's several cemeteries had markers. The assessment included the forgotten graves that remained in the old city cemetery near the grounds of Central School, Benton Avenue, and the Catholic Cemetery on Oaks. When Forestvale opened in 1890, it immediately became the favored burial place for Protestant and non-sectarian families. Many prominent pioneer families who had parents and children buried at Benton Avenue moved their relatives to the more desirable new cemetery.
There were people from Benton Avenue who were sort of exhumed and moved. Sometimes people who had been buried at Central and then reburied at Benton were dug up and buried again out at Forestvale.
Argyle Parkinson and Anna Davenport were children of the prominent early Helena pioneers who were among the first, after Rodney Pokaki, to die in the new settlement. Argyle, an infant, died of brain fever in the spring of 1865, and 10-year-old Anna succumbed to the effects of measles contracted en route to Montana on the steamboat St. John. Another Davenport child died of scarlet fever early in February of 1875. Incomplete records indicate these children were all buried in the old cemetery on the site of Central School. The two families moved their children first from the city cemetery to Benton Avenue, and again from Benton Avenue to Forestvale, where their headstones today are included in their respective family plots. The high school was long in completion from 1890 to 1893. During this 3-year period, additional graves that still dotted the former grounds of the old city cemetery were moved, some to Forestvale and some to Benton Avenue. Forestvale records specifically indicate that some of these reinterments by name and date spanning from the late 1880s to the early 1890s. There is no record of reinterments at Benton Avenue from this time period. However, the dozens of unmarked graves very close together, especially in the northwest quadrant, clearly indicate this activity. Unidentified bodies from the old city cemetery were a problem during this period in Helena. Family ties run deep, even in death, and family loss provided impetus for the removal of loved ones interred Benton Avenue. The entire Brooke family, for example, including the children's father and mother, were removed from Benton Avenue and reinterred at Forestvale upon the death of their daughter-in-law, Bertha Brooke, in 1920. By 1966, neglect had taken a toll on Benton Avenue Cemetery. Lucille Baker, a secretary in the office of Governor Tim Babcock, passed by it each morning on her way to work. Distressed at this lack of respect for Helena's early settlers, Mrs. Baker determined to do something about it and challenged the community to help her. 100 volunteers carted out trash, weeded, and raked. One-time call for help stretched into months and then years. Mrs. Baker arranged for students at Carroll College to take care of the grounds and organized a campaign to finance it called Pennies from Heaven. On Memorial Day, May 30th, 1968, state and local officials rededicated the Benton Avenue Cemetery. Lucy Baker received a citation from Keep America Beautiful for her unique reclamation project. The Governor's Commission on Historic Preservation designated the cemetery as a historical site in 1974. Lucy Baker moved out of state, but continued her crusade through voluminous correspondence, but the Pioneer Cemetery again began to deteriorate. In 1998, the Benton Avenue Cemetery Association reorganized and is now an active group taking the lead in bringing recognition to it and keeping the cemetery clean and well-maintained. Lucy Baker's dream of listing the Benton Avenue Cemetery on the National Register of Historic Places came to fruition in 2003. Wood, marble, metal, and granite chronicle the change in fashion and progression from imported marble or catalog-ordered markers to locally crafted monuments. The only landscaping is ancient lilacs, small shrubs, and occasionally bloom the family members who once tended their loved ones' graves planted there. Nancy Cormier and Karen Fred are cemetery board members who always lend a hand on the yearly cleanup crew. On one of these cleanup days, they and the other board members were going about their tasks when a car drove up in the alley along the cemetery's south side. The driver honked the horn, jumped out of the car, and began gesturing frantically. Nancy recalls that one of the workers ambled over, curious to see what was behind the woman's wild gesturing. She said, quote, "Just thought you'd like to know that there are some people walking in the cemetery." The worker said, "Well, of course there are." What was she trying to say? No, she explained. I mean, there are, like dead people gathered over there watching you work. There's a woman in a long dress with 2 little children and others gathered over there, she said, pointing in the area of the back of the grounds. The crew member returned to the group reporting what she had just heard. Sometime later, Nancy came across a reference to the diphtheria epidemic and the connection between the Cohen children and Mrs. Dunphy. Their graves are in the same general area where the woman claimed to have seen the crowd of ghostly observers. The Quinn's children's tombstone is one of 3 exactly alike, likely ordered from a catalog and inscribed locally. The most charming and the most poignant of all the tombstones at Benton Avenue. A child-sized chair with a hat tossed upon it, little shoes tucked underneath, clothing draped across the back, tossed there as if some other diversion captured the attention of the little owners, who then quickly cast it aside. With all the unrest and disturbing of what was supposed to be the final resting place for those that settled the Last Chance community, there is sure to be remnants of the past that wasn't really given a chance to truly rest. Do these spirits wander the cemetery looking for their loved ones, or are they simply admiring the effort put in by many to preserve the memory of what was once the largest town in Montana, founded on last chance hopes and dreams?
I think, there's always a kernel of truth to these stories. I'm always really surprised that there aren't more stories than there are. I wish there were more stories about people not resting at peace, because obviously a lot of people in Helena aren't resting in peace. But the stories really are kind of few and far between. And so the ones that we have are that much more interesting because they're kind of rare. The thing that's interesting to me is that when they celebrated the first Decoration Day here in Helena in the 1880s, they did an inventory of all of the cemeteries, and they only found that 1/4 of the graves were marked.
There's no doubt about it. Montana is rich in history, and with this history, it brings the memories of the past back to roam the streets and alleyways, the grasslands and the mountainsides, and the homes and final resting places. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying that the history alone is enough to warrant further thought of what truly is left over from what was once a Wild West territory, all trying to make it big and provide a better life for themselves and family. One thing that you have to remember about ghosts is that it doesn't matter if you believe in them or not. If they are there, then they are there. Until next time.